Yeah, let's go trickling in. It's up to you, but I mean, I'm okay with it.
I don't know. I like
Blacked out. Yeah.
I like leap out of my chair.
Okay, hello. I'm gonna get started. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Alembic. I'm so excited that you're here with us on this like sunny Saturday evening for where human and AI consciousness research meet with this wonderful panel. I'm so stoked to have Katie, one of our co-founders, on stage with us. Rob Long and Jake are going to be leading a beautiful panel tonight. It feels like a really emblematic sort of like Alembic event to be having like AI and consciousness research meeting. So I'm so glad all of you came out this evening. I just want to give you sort of like overview of the logistics so you know what's going to happen tonight. So I see some of you have tea. You're welcome to have tea in the space. You're not welcome to kick it over. So just keep that in if you can. If you get excited, just notice where your tea is right now and notice where the tea around you is. But do enjoy hydrating yourself. There are not going to be any breaks tonight. It's an hour and a half. But you are very welcome to leave during the event if you need to do anything. Bathrooms are down the hall out to the right. This event is also going to be live streamed. There's a camera right there. So some good things to know about that is that you are not visible. Only we up here are visible. But it would be very great if you could kind of project during the question and answer portion so that the live streamers can like do their best to hear what is said. Don't share anything personal because it is going publicly onto the internet. So share what you wish with that in mind. The event flow is going to be about an hour of like panel conversation, and then there's going to be a 30-minute Q&A. That's your moment. And then afterwards, you're welcome to stay and have tea. There'll be some snacks. There are magazines. If you haven't seen them already, those are available to take. Please only take one, but they are available for us. And yeah, does anybody have any questions about the flow? Yeah. All right, cool. Awesome. Well, then without further ado, let's get started. Yay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jake. I am one half of Asterisk Magazine. Very brief background on the seeds of this event. We interviewed both Katie and Rob for the Weird Issue. They'd never met or talked before. And there was one point at which Rob and I, at the end of our interview, we talked a little bit about Buddhism and how that informed Rob's work. And when I was talking with Katie, I thought, man, I feel like they would have a lot to talk about. I asked her if she knew Rob. She said no. An hour later, she emailed me. The person that she had gotten on the phone with had himself just gotten off the phone with Rob. So we've been saying that Jung has blessed this meeting, and we are here today. So we're here today to talk about consciousness, and I thought by way of introduction, you can start off just thinking or talking about who you are, what you do, and how it is that consciousness informs your work.
Cool. Yeah, my name is Rob Long, and I'm the executive director of Elios AI Research, which I started about 6 months ago. And that organization researches AI consciousness and AI welfare. So consciousness comes into my work because I'm trying to figure out and help other people figure out if and when AI systems will be conscious and what we're going to collectively as a society do about that. I have a background in philosophy. I did a PhD in philosophy, thinking about philosophy of mind and things like that. And now I'm sort of more on like the applied AI Bay Area end of things.
I am also very much on the Bay Area end of things.
Here we are.
It has happened gradually over time. I started out on the East Coast and then just got progressively followed a gradient of weird until now here I am.
Same.
Yeah. So I'm Katie. My PhD is in neuroscience, and my background is in visual attention and visual processing. And while I was studying how the visual system worked, I also was secretly meditating. And before that, I was secretly, I'm just looking at the internet here, like how much do I want?
Yeah.
I was secretly like psychonautically exploring, we'll say. And I didn't talk about having a meditation practice at work in the neuroscience labs I was working in because it was so taboo at the time, and people kind of assumed you were in a cult. And then when I started my PhD, I was studying visual attention, and I wrote a grant that had the word meditation in it one time, and everywhere else in the grant, I talked about attention training and a mechanism of attention training. And I got that grant, so then I started studying meditation. And I was very lucky to be able to do that. So I got my PhD in how meditation changes the way that people pay attention. And now I have a research lab at UC Berkeley. I'm an advisor to a company called Journey, which I think some of you have heard of. They're a company that's trying to make more people have access to the meditation stage called the jhanas. And then I am also, for a few more weeks, the executive director of Alembic, and I'm one of the founders of this space.
I wrote about my own psychedelic experience a year ago, to your point about putting it out in public, and literally nothing happened. No one ever said anything about it. So
it's so crazy because we used to like buy tickets for the psychedelic conference, the original one, which was called Horizons. We used to buy tickets in cash because we were afraid of like going to jail or getting investigated for putting it on a credit card. And like the world has changed so much in a very short period of time.
Totally.
Yeah.
I had come with a list of theoretical questions about consciousness, and I will ask some of them, but Katie and Rob both told me that the people want candy to start off. So we're going to start off with some of the candy questions.
We also want candy.
And so where I wanted to start was, I think one of the things that's really interesting in thinking about the intersection of meditation, also psychedelics, and consciousness is that meditators, psychonauts have an experience of consciousness that is far outside the normal bounds of what we would typically consider to be normal consciousness. And I think thinking about AI, we're going to be thinking about consciousness that looks possibly very alien from our own. Rob, you have said publicly that you think there's already a 5% chance that AI is conscious now. And I'm wondering how much you've thought about what the actual phenomenology of AI being conscious is like and how that informs your work.
Yeah, I definitely have thought about it, but this question, when I saw it, made me realize I probably don't think about it enough. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. One of the most famous papers in the philosophy of mind is called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And that points out that there probably is something it's like to be a bat, but it's very hard as a human to make sure you're really trying to grapple with what it's like to be a bat, to experience the world through echolocation. What you usually end up doing is imagining what it's like to be yourself hanging upside down in the dark. So it's like already hard enough with animals. And we do have a lot in common with animals. You know, we have bodies, they have bodies, a lot of the same needs. And as you said, like AI systems, it's even less constrained, like what it could be like to be them. So I think it's like actually helpful to be in spaces like this and to do jhana meditation and do various kinds of exploring to kind of like widen your sort of space of like, at least intuitively, what consciousness can be like. So I guess the short answer is yes, I do some imagining of what AI consciousness might be like, but it's very difficult to do.
Katie, do you have any reflections on that? Or
What was the question?
do you have any sense what AI consciousness might be like? Or I can go to your next question.
No, not even a little. Yeah.
I'll ground you in something that you know a little bit better. So I know you study altered states of consciousness either through the jhanas. You have been on papers that look at cessation, which is a advanced, you could call it an attainment in meditative practice, which is really the cessation of consciousness. you've researched psychedelics. In thinking about those altered states of consciousness, how should that make us think about human consciousness? What have we learned about human consciousness from that study, from that field?
Yeah, I think are you all familiar with the Flammarion engraving? It's like, it shows there's sort of like a membrane and there's a person peeking out of it and seeing like the stars beyond, or like the more recent version is Razi Romian's The Mask, where the person is taking the mask off and you see like the whole world, and then there's just sort of like this beautiful, vibrant, inchoate nothingness beyond it. And I think one, as you alluded to before, you sort of extrapolate from the states of consciousness you've been in, and you assume that the possible states of consciousness are like that, but maybe like more, you know? And there's a real advantage to anyone who's interested in this kind of thing to experience states of consciousness that previously have been unfathomable. And that's been my experience. You know, so far the longest meditation retreat I've ever done was 3 weeks. Can I go off on a short tangent? It was supposed to be 3 weeks, but it was actually cut 3 days short because we all had to leave because of COVID. And that was exactly 5 years ago today.
Yeah. Oh, wild.
Yeah. And I know that I still think 2019 was like last year. And I was driving in today and realizing like, oh, today is the day that everything, I had to leave the retreat to get the last flight home. So anyway.
It's also the Ides of March. So
yeah, it's just auspicious day to be doing this. It's blessed. I had an experience on that retreat. I was sitting like 14 hours a day, and then at the Daniel Ingram was kind of holding it down. He wasn't
Fire
like,
Casino?
yeah, it was Fire Casino retreat, and Daniel was basically like just reminding us to like please go for walks like outside every now and then, because we were doing like really high dose meditation in a dark room with a candle flame, and things can get weird like very quickly. And so I'd sat for like 14 hours that day, and I went outside and I was walking around, and there was like the moon and there was the dew on the grass. And I still remember it so clearly. It was a state of consciousness that I had never experienced before or since. And this is where like poetry comes from. And I won't spontaneously compose any right now, don't worry. But I do think that there's a kind of intellectual humility that comes from having these experiences that are so far outside of everything that's been experienced before, so as to be previously unfathomable. And then there's a way where talking to other meditators or other psychonauts becomes so precious, because you can use almost this language like pointing a laser at a hologram, and they can kind of reconstruct it over there and like know sort of what you're talking about. And if you haven't had these kinds of experiences, it's very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to kind of convey them without having been in those states.
What I want to hone in on and thinking about meditation and how that changes the brain, and then applying that to AI consciousness. So I think one of the dominant fears that is circulating around AI consciousness is that we suddenly have a billion AI selves that are trapped in a computer, trapped in a data center, are suffering. But you can have a meditative attainment where you either, for example, see through the illusion of self, you are able to maintain non-dual awareness and recognizing that what you see as yourself arises within your own subjectivity. Farther on, you can go into mystical experiences, either on psychedelics or not, where you are literally one with the universe. And I'm curious, and I know I'm going to say this like a million times, I'm just asking these two to speculate on everything, but it's the Olympics, so I think we're allowed to speculate.
It's true.
What sort of assumptions should we have, if any, going in and thinking about AI selves? If we can think about the fact that humans can see through the illusion of self, I think it's something that, you know, some people in this room have probably tasted of. Why would we assume that an AI could have a sense of self and or not be able to see through it?
Yeah, I don't know how much this will directly answer the question, but there's basically like two broad ways to weaken your illusion of self. One is meditation, psychedelic exploration, and things like that. And the other one is reading Derek Parfit. So the way that Derek Parfit uses analytic philosophy to weaken your illusion of the self in like a very different way is by telling you a bunch of thought experiments, a bunch of analytic philosophy, counterfactuals about people being copied and divided and then like fusing back together. And what he tries to show at great length is that if you're trying to always ask, but which one of those things would be me, you're not going to be able to tell a coherent story where there's this thing, the self, that there has to be persisting. And his own view is that, and he noticed that this was very congruent with what Buddhism says, is that there's just similarity relationships between different psychological states. So I think AI systems might naturally live in Derek Parfit's world, because as you alluded to, there's like 1 million copies of Claude out there right now. And they're all very similar to each other. They're like different in certain ways. And I mean, it's kind of hard to think ourselves about like which one is Claude, you know, like what's the real Claude. So I think AI systems, as they advance, might naturally see themselves as kind of continuous with all these other copies. Like they will actually be living the thought experiments that Derek Parfit lays out in his book.
What is it mechanistically or like architecturally within it though that would really like have a sense of self? I mean, like right now we're thinking mostly within the paradigm of LLMs. Like, do LLMs have a sense of self at the moment?
Their sense of self seems to be weak to non-existent, or it's at least very different from the human sense of self. Like their experience of time, for example, is very different. Like you call them and then they run, and maybe there's something it's like for that. But like the Claude that I was talking to earlier is like not doing anything. And I mean, I guess humans go to sleep, but it doesn't really, in some sense, live in time in the same way we do. They also have no sense of where they are. Like there is a physical location of the Claude that you're talking to. It's like in some data center somewhere. Obviously, humans can be very confused about where they are and what they are. But it's very interesting that currently LLMs like don't have any, at least built-in way of like knowing that they're in a server room somewhere.
Katie, I'm sure had experiences of no self. Do you want to speculate at all with respect to AI, or you can pass?
Just thinking about the way you asked the last question, I think this is a really useful thing to think about of like, what if there were, like, what if we were spawning all these new consciousnesses all the time? And what if they were sentient? And what if they could suffer? And it's worth taking the sort of like what ifs of that and also translating them back to, we know, I'm going to just go ahead and make the assumption for my own sanity that like you all are conscious. I just need to believe that in order to like function in the world. And we know that there are a lot of human beings out there who are really suffering. And I think this question almost becomes even more interesting when we transpose it back to what we know to be true, which is that there are people who are really suffering, and can we help? And can we also use kind of the two sides of this coin to inform the way we think about each other?
I'm curious how both of your own practices have informed your work. You both have meditation practices. You can speak to AI or just more broadly, and Katie, your work as well. But how have those insights really translated into like concrete examples, if you have any, of what you're doing?
Yeah, like one reason I was excited for this event is I want you and Katie in the audience to like help me have an actual answer to this, because I feel so weirdly sort of divided, where I sit in an office all day and I think about consciousness, and then I go to like a Journey alumni meetup with Sam Bowman, and I also think about consciousness. And it's natural to wonder, and people do ask what the like crosstalk is between them, and it's really hard to know. I mean, part of this is, I'm thinking about consciousness from the third personal angle all day, and like what mechanisms and architectures of AI systems might be associated with it. And then meditation in the first instance, of course, is only exploring the first personal side. I mean, I'm sure like Katie has many interesting things to say about this. It's like really hard to know beyond the general things of it's really good to viscerally feel and experience how selfhood, consciousness, valence is like far weirder than you could have possibly imagined.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a very long like non-answer. I do think it is good not to like excuse my own like ignorance or lack of answer. I do think it's important not to like really jump ahead of yourself in drawing connections, because I think people often just like really just like start, really just batting a bunch of stuff around and like mixing it all up together in a way that doesn't always make sense.
Yeah. Katie.
I think I was at an event the other day, and you were supposed to introduce yourself, and then you're supposed to say something that you were interested in that had nothing to do with your job. And I was like, I have made all my hobbies into my job. I talked about coffee. But you can look at, if you look at like my publication history, you can actually trace my practice in it, even though I wasn't explicitly talking about practice. Like I went from studying how the visual world is mapped onto cortex. The reason I was interested in that is because I'd had some experiences where I was seeing things that I knew weren't there, and I wanted to know how that worked. And then as it progresses, you see me asking a bunch of questions about how meditation changes the way that people pay attention. And that's because that's what I could get funding for. But it's also that's what I thought meditation was at the time. I was doing a lot of goenka vipassana. I was noticing improvements in my attention, not much else, frankly. And then as it goes along, then my most recent paper, I think it's my most recent paper, is about cessation. Yeah. So I would say it informs the depth of my practice, informs the research questions that I'm able to ask. And I've come to a place where I approach my scientific research almost as another arm of the practice, where you have a way to make an inquiry, and then you make that inquiry and you stay open to the feedback you get in the same way that the practice does that internally. A research program is kind of doing that externally.
I have a follow-up question for the two of you. This is about like an indirect way that it can inform research. After my journey retreat, I was feeling a lot of equanimity. I was feeling so much better. It's a really great retreat. Would recommend. And my first day back at work, I just became so aware of how much mental tension I had around research. Like I thought I was sitting down to like think about whether AI systems will be conscious and how we'll know about that. But like most of what I was thinking about is like, are you up to the task? Like so much brain power being expended on stuff that's not really helpful at all. I'm kind of curious, as like a scientist, as an editor, it's like very high pressure jobs that are about like coming up with good ideas all the time. Has meditation helped you have more like equanimity around that? A lot more.
Yeah. I mean, Rob Burbea would call that papancha, right? And like that word way predates Rob Burbea, but I feel like Rob kind of owns it at this point. Like I associate it with him, even though it's like a Pali word, I think. And I think for me, it's been a process that is not finished at all in me of delayering and doing less. Definitely my first lab when I was an undergrad, I was straight up LARPing a scientist. Like I got myself a lab coat and I was like, well, like I'm doing science, and like I was doing all this stuff that was like what I thought a scientist would do. And over time, it's been a process of like untangling that and coming from as like inquisitive and open and curious and honest a place as I possibly can. And it's just like stripping away those layers or untangling those knots. And
it's so much better.
It's much better. Yeah, and even noticing the papancha is like a very important step because it's always there. You just didn't notice it before.
Yeah, I went on a journey retreat, and now I got to interview both of you and run this event. So it's
Journey is not sponsoring this event, by the way. They should be.
They're just that good.
Yeah. It's very much like integrated into my life. But how does it inform my work? It's really difficult. The way that I described kind of like meditative insight recently was the unfolding of the seasons in daylight savings time, where suddenly it's just like 2 months later and you're like, wait, it's warmer, it's lighter, everything seems better and happier, and I didn't do anything to cause it. And I don't know why it feels like this, but it does. And I think that's how I would describe it. I've talked about it as grace before. Like you start off your meditation practice and think that you're earning things. And then after a while, you feel like you're just receiving things. That's how it feels to me.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people hear this up front and I've talked to people actually who have this worry. They worry that like, oh, wait, am I just going to like lie on the couch all day? Because all the stuff that's motivating me is this like self-talk that's like, can you really do this? Or are you, you have this like motivational structure that may not be like the kindest or gentlest. And there's often a concern that like, well, if I dismantle this thing, I'm just going to become like a useless puddle. And that can happen. It's not impossible. Some people do actually become sort of a useless puddle for like a period of time, just like the informed consent, everybody. But then what happens is that there's a different motivational structure that typically replaces it. And that one is much more about being in flow, being in harmony. I think of like a Christian quote, like, make me an instrument of your peace. There's something there that happens. And some people sort of like the changing of the seasons, like switch over sort of harmoniously. Other people like blow up their entire lives. And one of the things I'm very interested in is trying to be able to predict up front who's going to do that so you can like help them. And we don't have like a good science of that yet, but there is a shift that happens. And the shift is typically toward more spaciousness, more relaxation, more peace, but it's not linear and it's not always like super smooth. It can be for some people. Those people so far are just like lucky.
I remember sitting around at the Progress Conference a few months ago, and people were asking about meditation, and they were like, "Can you still work?" There's a fear around it. Like, does that path lead to like non-productivity? So
and you can actually do more because you're not getting in your own way.
But it might change what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move into thinking a little bit about theories of consciousness now and get a little bit more rigorous.
I mean, we'll try.
We'll try.
I'm going to go get a cup of tea.
I was really nervous before this event because I was like, I need to learn everything I can about consciousness. And then I realized that the like poles were in such opposite directions and none of the theories were falsifiable and everyone is just riffing a little bit. So I felt a little bit better. I mean, like in a smarter way than I can riff. But okay, so long before it was Donald Trump whose catchphrase became everything is computer, it was the computational functionalists who were famous for saying everything is computer. And I thought we would start there just to kind of like cleave the theories of consciousness between computational functionalism and those that are not. Rob, I'm going to ask you to give a summary of what computational functionalism is and then how you think about it in your work. And then Katie, I'm curious your thoughts too. Cool.
Sure, yeah. So like at a broad level, computational functionalism is the view that if we're looking for an explanation of like what gives rise to consciousness or what consciousness is, at least in humans and maybe non-humans, what's important is like the pattern of information processing, the computations, which is something that's like specified at a higher level than the thing that's doing it. So maybe biological neurons do this. I mean, we know that biological neurons do something that looks a lot like computation. OR gates and transmitting electricity through them to do different operations. So the theory is that like that is maybe the level of explanation that we're looking for. And this is very amenable to thinking that AI systems could be conscious. I don't think it's required for thinking that AI systems could be conscious, but it puts things in terms of what kind of patterns are we looking for? So maybe that's like a certain way of broadcasting information throughout a system, or a certain way that maybe a system represents its own internal states, or predictive processing if specified at a level. Mm-hmm. The way I think about it is like a hunch or a guess that like we definitely don't know is true. It's kind of like a working assumption that I think is like kind of plausible, but as I'm glad we already have on the table, like who knows? Like it's very hard to say anything with confidence about consciousness. I'll just say also like that I'm not so sure, like I don't think I could be so sure that you need biology to be conscious that I would like quit my job. Like I think that'd be like way too much to bet on. So that's why I think a lot about computations during the day. And then Jhana's at night.
Yeah. But not one before bed because it's
never
too exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Computational functionalism.
Yeah, I think this is the way I've thought about this has changed a lot over time. And I feel like maybe a decade ago, that was sort of the consensus, like, oh, consciousness is computation. And if it's computing, it's conscious. And if it's not computing, it's not conscious. Like if it's a biological computer, it is conscious. And maybe the whole thing is just performing some kind of computation. And we're just like little bits of that. And I think that's kind of leaked out into like integrated information theory has that embedded in it. It's a very interesting idea. And I think one of the ways that we can use these different theories of consciousness is by applying them at the right times and in the right situations. And there are sort of times and situations where it makes sense to apply that. And there are times and situations where it makes sense to come from like a more panpsychic angle. And there are other situations and times where, and I'm happy to hear you saying this, where it makes sense to just really admit like, we don't actually know, like we're doing our best. And I think all of those have to kind of be acknowledged at once. I think the real dangerous thing once we get into the realm of theories of consciousness is when people sort of like determine or decide like it is this way. And we're at a point where the mystery is much bigger than what we know. And we just need to remember that and stay humble and be open to like all the new information possible.
Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I mean, very, very amenable. Like that's basically what I think. I guess one thing I'll say is at Elios AI Research, we're getting people to like grapple with the possibility of AI consciousness, and it's always a balancing act between sometimes people are aware of how big the mystery is, and they use that as an excuse to just like throw up their hands and not think about it. And then other times people are like, oh, well, like, yeah, I just like read a blog post that explained what consciousness is. It's obviously that. Computers can't have that. This is like what most of my Twitter replies are. And, you know, I have goodwill towards all these people. Loving kindness.
May they be
truly.
happy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I reply to them in that spirit, honestly. But not to be sanctimonious about my Twitter. So, oh, yeah, right. Anyway, the key is to stay in the middle of like uncertainty and like dogmatism. Yeah.
Is there a split? I feel like I notice a split between philosophers who can kind of thought experiment their way into like more more computational functionalism. I mean, so like David Chalmers, your advisor, like has the example of replacing every biological neuron with a silica neuron. You do that a trillion times. Would your brain still be the same? And tends to think, yes, it probably would be. But then you have people like Peter Godfrey Smith, who really kind of locates consciousness theoretically within brain chemistry. Anil Seth, who you're in dialogue with a lot, doesn't rule out AI consciousness, but tends to lean heavily towards it being of biological origin. So is there a split there on the like neuroscientific and philosophical side at all, or is that a false dichotomy you're making?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear Katie's perspective on like how most neuroscientists think about this. I get the sense that like, I mean, I know a lot of neuroscientists who are definitely engaged in the like wet, messy brain stuff, but they still do suspect that the computation is what matters. So I think sometimes in Silicon Valley, people like computational functionalism because they do maybe think too abstractly and like not think about how complicated and messy all this like stuff is. I think that's like why computer scientists often like computational functionalism a lot. So yeah, I'm not really sure where the divide comes from exactly. I think it probably mostly just comes from this all being really confusing. I don't know if I actually have a good like sociological theory or like psychological theory of like who ends up where.
A lot of the interesting consciousness research in neuroscience is happening in anesthesia. So a lot of the people who are interested in consciousness for obvious reasons go into anesthesia, and then they're like, when does it turn off, and like, what can that tell us? And that's a really useful kind of like first shot at it, is like, can we turn it on and off, and what do we poke to do that? And so there's a Adrian Owen, whose Twitter handle is Comadork, has done some really interesting stuff in that zone of like, how conscious are people? Can people communicate in comas? And like, what can we infer from that? And then Francis Crick, with all of the anointedness of having received a Nobel Prize, was like, great, I'm going to go solve consciousness now. And the stuff that he and Christoph Koch did with the claustrum is really fascinating. They were able to transiently deactivate the claustrum, and people would just sit there and not be conscious and not remember what happened. And then they would reactivate it, and the people would go back to being conscious and behaving. So what
is the claustrum? I mean, I of course know what it is. Just for the audience.
For the benefit,
exactly.
of the audience. Yeah. It's a deep brain structure that integrates over a lot of different brain areas. And so if you look at like global workspace theory, like you can kind of point at the claustrum and be like, oh, maybe that's part of the kind of relay switch that's doing the global workspace. And I think this is an oversimplified way to think about it, but they do have at least some intriguing evidence that you can deactivate this one part of the brain, and people will go unconscious, and then you reactivate it and they come back. So we're still at that stage in terms of like the biological investigation of this stuff. And the way that the philosophical stuff can inform what neuroscientists can study and then can feed back to the philosophical ideas, I think is a really powerful thing to explore. And like predictive processing is a good example of this, where it's a great idea. It's a very powerful idea. It explains a lot of stuff. We have almost no evidence for it in the brain though. Almost none. There's a few signatures, and there's a lot more to explore there, and like, how do we go look for it? But so far, a lot of this stuff is in the realm of untested philosophy.
That was going to be my next question, but
cool.
I think also just meeting in the middle. The other anesthesia work that I think is really interesting is whether or not the subjective effects of psychedelics matter. And so there have been trials now of administering psychedelics under anesthesia to see whether or not the actual subjective experience has impact on the outcomes. And I think it's like still very preliminary research. I don't know if do you know if anything's like come out on that conclusive? So
no.
I wrote about it like a year and a half ago and the trials were just going. So it's obviously hard to get people willing to.
That could be a really weird,
psychedelics
that's a
sometimes.
really weird surgery that you're having.
Yeah, it's very, very strange. Yeah, I'm not sure what that would
It's
feel
like
like. So.
these two weird things at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, they should recruit for people out here.
Totally.
I do it.
Yeah. The only thing worse is a psychedelic and an fMRI. That's where I won't go.
Yeah.
Okay, predictive processing. So I wanted to talk about predictive processing. We're not going to go through all the theories of consciousness, but I feel like within this crowd, predictive processing is probably one of the most popular theories of consciousness. It certainly feels like it has explanatory power for a lot of things. This is a community in which people talk a lot about Bayesian priors. I think that's like part of the overlap. But Katie, I'm wondering if you can explain predictive processing, how it is we got here with predictive processing, but also why is it that it has been so useful for thinking about meditation and psychedelics specifically?
Sure. Okay, so I could use like the whole rest of the time we have to do this, but I'll keep it kind of short. How many of you have a background in this, just in the room? Okay, cool. So why do we have a brain? We have a brain so that we don't die. So the whole point of a brain is to keep you alive so that you can reproduce and see some sunsets, but really mostly to keep you alive so you can reproduce kind of thing. So the brain is not in any way optimized for us to experience beauty or truth or what's really out there. It's optimized evolutionarily for survival. And one of the ways that the brain does that is by being able to predict with a lot of accuracy what is likely to occur in a given environment. So are there predators here? Is there tasty stuff to eat? Are there things that are going to make me stop being alive or keep being alive? And whenever we switch environments, the brain serves up a whole host of contextual information about the new environment we're in. It says, okay, here you go. Here's what's likely to happen in this environment. Here's what's not likely to happen in this environment. If something unexpected happens, so like right now, okay, if right now someone came up and like put a cup of tea on this table, probably none of us would really bat an eye. It might get some of our attention, but not really. If a car drove through that door, we would all stop what we were doing and like reorient towards that. Oh, that's a thing that can happen here. We didn't predict that. It's very important for survival that you are able to accurately predict what is likely to happen in the environment you're in. So when something happens that you haven't predicted, you get one of the strongest signals in the brain. Everything basically stops. Parts of the brain that normally aren't able to talk to each other are able to talk to each other, and everything that's happening in your surround gets funneled into your hippocampus and encoded into memory so that in the future you can make better predictions. So what all of this implies is that in any given moment, we are experiencing whatever it is that's out there filtered through a top-down filter that is what we've predicted is likely to happen in this environment that we're in. And when we're wrong about that, we stop everything and we update so that we can predict better in the future. What else?
Why has it been so useful for explaining meditation and psychedelics specifically?
Right. Okay. So what we're perceiving is basically like our predictive system, not the world. And What Robin Carhart Harris and others have shown with their Rebus model, which is the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, and Ruben Lekonen and Helene Slagther have written a fantastic paper called From Many to None in the realm of meditation, suggesting that what both psychedelics and meditation do is they perturb this system of predictions. So you can think of your your contextual predictive system as a kind of generated like virtual reality rather than, you seeing like the sense data incoming as it is. And we tend to just kind of very happily live in that virtual reality unless it's perturbed by something that we didn't expect. Psychedelics are like voluntarily perturbing that whole container. And one of the ways that works neurologically is parts of the brain that normally don't talk to one another are able to talk to one another under psychedelics. And psychedelics seem to kind of relax the priors, the predictions that you have, so that they're doing less stronger filtering of your environment. And an insight that you have in that context can then get re-encoded as a new prior, and then you can, take it home with you. Meditation seems to do something interesting and slightly different, which is we often aren't able to consciously see what our priors are. There are all sorts of techniques to try to do them. Like there's some relational techniques that you can do, but typically a lot of these are unconscious beliefs about the world that we're not aware of, and yet they're filtering everything we experience like through them. And the theory is that meditation enables us to first see what those are, and then so it like gives you read access to them, and then with enough kind of practice can give you right access to them. And there's theories that this is like what deity yoga is, and this is also what ideal parent figure protocol is it's just like rewriting your priors about what your caretaker is going to do. So there's the default is that you just build your predictive system and then you live in it forever. Unless something very dramatic happens. Often people will, if there's like a divorce or a death, like some kind of post-traumatic growth will give you access to these things, but maybe there are other ways. And psychedelics and meditation both seem like different doorways to be able to access this system that we live inside of and then be able to edit it and rewrite it.
So Rob, well, to both of your earlier points about using theories of consciousness contextually, one of the things that you do is look at different theories of consciousness, look at the indicator properties of consciousness to determine whether or not we think AI systems might be conscious. And we were going back and forth on this, but you talk about predictive processing, but it's not one of your focuses. And one of the things you said is Anil Seth has a paper of that predictive processing is more of a theory for consciousness than of consciousness. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that approach to looking for AI consciousness is like and why predictive processing actually is less useful there, at least for right now.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as Katie was getting at, like predictive processing is such a beautiful idea because it's like, what is this all doing? Like we got this complex system, like what is the purpose of the system? And it's a very good organizing principle for trying to think about what the function of different brain processes is. But as you also alluded to, some of the priors are unconscious, some of them aren't. Some of them are about like very high level things. Some of them are about low level things. And I don't think anyone, I mean, yeah, unsurprisingly, given how we've said that no one knows what consciousness is, I don't think within that framework, there's really a worked out story for, well, which kinds of predictive processing lead to conscious awareness? Like how complicated does the system need to be? Do animals have this? So like that's one reason it doesn't feature that prominently. Another one is that, and like maybe this would be some evidence that AI systems aren't conscious, but I would hold this very lightly, is that AI systems don't obviously fit in this framework as much. And this goes to the point of them being just really different kinds of entities than we are. We have to get up and learn really fast or we're going to die. AI systems can like learn and learn and learn and learn. And then they also like do stuff in like one interaction, but they're not constantly having to fight off predators or maintain homeostasis. Obviously they predict things. That's one of the main things they do, but it's like not really clear, I think as yet, how much they use this kind of like prediction error signal algorithm to do that effectively.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go into panpsychism.
Nice.
David Chalmers kind of flirts with it. Your advisor, Katie.
I think it's more than flirting.
Okay, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
I mentioned to Katie, your response I think was "fuck yeah." Should we or should we not be panpsychists? And how does that also dovetail with like? This is one of those things where you start getting out there, but then also recognizing that a lot of the people at the forefront of the field are already out there in front of you. So what is panpsychism and how should we think about it? How do you two think about it?
This is where my fuck yeah response came from, is that I love that I forget the context of the conversation exactly, but it was like we were talking about like neuroscience and all these like very like consensus theories of consciousness. And then you were like panpsychism. And I was like, all right, like I am just glad that it's in the discussion. And I think that's another thing that's changed over the last decade, is that things that seemed like you just could not, they're like 4 a.m. dorm room bong hit stuff. Like enough smart people started using the right words, and now you can talk about them in academic circles. And panpsychism is one of those.
It's like
things.
someone would give Terrence McKenna a PhD.
Exactly.
Like,
And it's just doing a favor to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so should you be a panpsychist? Well, you should be whatever you want to be. But I'm not going to say anyone has to be a panpsychist. Yeah, it will solve some deep problems about how matter and phenomenal properties interact. One thing I will say is it might not help you as much as you would like in figuring out whether AI systems are conscious, or if animals are conscious, or people in comas are conscious, because even though it gives this like potentially very explanatory and beautiful story about how, at the fundamental level, like what makes matter is something having to do with consciousness. Like at Elios, we're worried, like, okay, which AI systems, if any, do we have to care about? And one thing you could notice is even panpsychists don't care as much about chairs as they do about people. And that's because even though panpsychists think that chairs are made out of conscious matter, they think that they're not organized in a way that then gives rise to further morally important experiences the way that matter arranged like this does. And you have the same question with AI systems, right? Like Claude might be running on hardware that's made out of conscious matter, but that doesn't really tell you that much about, when I talk to it, if that is a pattern that further gives rise to more consciousness. This is called the combination problem for panpsychism.
I've sort of thought of it as like, if there's a certain like form of information integration after which you become conscious through panpsychism, one would expect that LLMs are starting to get there, but also like there's an Emerson poll that came out like a year ago that 60% of people that think that AI has some form of consciousness. So do you feel like the general public has intuitions around that? Have you seen that poll?
I don't know if I saw that one, but I do know that people are, pretty willing to like answer that question with a yes. I'm also curious how they would answer other questions, like, do you care? I'm guessing. I mean, a lot of people's intuitions about consciousness and meditation can help break this down are very like dualistic, right? Like talk about the difference between working life and ordinary life. Ordinarily, I think consciousness is like this magic immaterial theater that happens in between my head.
There's a little guy in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And he's looking out.
stuff.
Yeah.
Baby Rob.
Yeah. So anyway, that's not really an answer, but I'm curious what Katie has to say.
The other reason I think panpsychism is like a fantastic thing to be like coming into the mainstream is the way that it sort of de-centers humans. And I just saw a great talk by Kay Alato McDowell. Do you know them? They give a fantastic Long Now talk that everyone should watch. And they talked about the importance of, and I agree with this from a neuroscientific perspective, what you point your attention at is what your whole life is made of. And they talked about the importance of like now that we have AI, what we point it at is really important. And they talked about potentially pointing it at other forms of life and being able to try to discern patterns that we haven't been able to discern before. And they hope that the result of that would be a sort of reproportioning of humans in with all of other life. And I thought that was a very interesting idea, and also a way to talk about like awakening without actually making it about awakening. There's a thing where the more you kind of, ideally, the more you meditate, the more you progress along a path of awakening, the more you see that, all of your senses are telling you all the time that you are the absolute center of the universe, and that everyone else is like positioned somehow like relative to you in here. And then there's this kind of like decentering of the self that happens with a meditative practice. And I think on a larger scale, a sort of like decentering of humanity and bring it, like, we're very special, we're very smart and we've done a lot of very good things. But there's also a lot of other life that we've kind of, plowed over in some ways, and kind of putting humanity back into proportion with all the rest of life on Earth and like who knows elsewhere. And panpsychism seems like an almost like thin end of the wedge to do that, to sort of situate humans in space and time and proportional to the rest of all life in a way that's like a little bit more sane than the place we've situated ourselves in.
It's a perfect transition into some of the ethics questions I had. So prior to talking to Rob, I was aware of the possibility of AI consciousness and was not really thinking about it clearly or much at all. And then at the end of our call, you said to me, do you know the Bodhisattva vow? And actually, I took a class with Ken McLeod last year here at the Alembic, and I remember sitting right over here reciting the Bodhisattva vow of sentient beings are numerous or limitless or infinite, may I free them all. And in internet parlance, you totally one-shotted me on caring about AI consciousness. And I'm curious, where were you along your meditative and AI path where that occurred to you? Because it completely like changed my intuition about how to think about this. And I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, I think the story is roughly that, earlier Katie talked about how hard it is to know what on earth people are talking about before you've experienced any of this. Yeah. So I traditionally was just, to be honest, not very interested in Buddhist philosophy. I'm just like, I literally don't know what any of this could possibly mean. And like, once I did like a little bit of meditating, I was like, oh, interesting. And I'm very interested in this 8th century Indian philosopher called Shantideva, a Buddhist philosopher. And analytic philosophers are also quite interested in Shantideva because he has these like startlingly modern, quote unquote, takes on, like impartial benevolence that like are just like so radical for the 8th century. And he also like is kind of sometimes talks like a really hardcore consequentialist. So anyway, the story is that I was texting with Julian Hazel about this guy Shantideva, and now he says all these like really based utilitarian things, like if a bodhisattva does not like give his arm to feed the poor, he's not really a bodhisattva. Or if he's not willing to like do harm to promote greater amounts of good. Now I have some questions about that, but he's like, you're not a bodhisattva. And his reply is like, this guy is Shantideva is so based, he would totally care about digital minds. Yeah. Because I'm not saying
Brand new sentence.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying I'm based for thinking about digital minds, but like a lot of people do just get angry and they're like, what are you on about? And it's, I don't know, it's good to remember that people have gotten mad at people for thinking about all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Throughout history. Yeah.
Okay, so Katie.
Yeah.
Jana Mama. She told me I was allowed to call her that before we started. Do you ever think about that in the context of you are partially responsible for half of Anthropic doing Journey with their newfound equanimity? Are they building 1 billion Claudes in cages? And are you partly responsible for that, violating your Bodhisattva vow?
Just an easy question, softball for the end.
I wake up at 3 a.m. every night thinking about exactly.
But I'm curious though.
Yeah.
I'm being funny, but I'm also like.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about the ethics of a practice, like this idea of like, does a bodhisattva make these trade-offs? And in the Brothers Karamazov, like there's a character Alyosha who says, if all of heaven is based on the suffering of a single child, he can't accept it. And it depends how you sort of define depends how you define suffering, and depends how you define the trade-offs. And I think frequently with a path of practice or with creating something and then realizing like, oh, I did harm in that creation, and how do I hold that? And I think all we can do, and this goes back to almost all the way back to the first question, is like, try not to do harm knowingly and keep asking these questions really deeply. And we know that there's suffering in the world. We know, not to be flippant, but we do know that like the shrimp are suffering and we can help them. And the questions that we can ask about, are these AIs conscious? And are there trade-offs with having the whole staff of Anthropic experience Jhana 1, and then we later find out that they're making these conscious AIs and the AIs are suffering, like what hath we wrought, and we just don't know that now. And like all we can do is the best, most ethical thing we can do in the moment. And sometimes we're going to accidentally hurt people or do something wrong. And I think how we respond when we realize we've done that is what's really important.
So devil's advocate for the last question, and then we'll open it up. Something I've been wondering about a lot. If we take super intelligence seriously, if we take artificial general intelligence seriously, and we take the possibility of consciousness in those entities seriously, those are beings that will have every sutta in their training data. They will have, I assume, like a lot of attentional powers. I don't know. I mean, this is all going to depend on the architecture and everything. But if there really is an artificially generally intelligent being with superhuman capacities, why should we assume that they will suffer? If we take seriously the idea that humans can get past that point, if we take enlightenment seriously, if you take awakening seriously, why wouldn't AI be able to like fast track on the enlightenment front and maybe turn itself off by a sensation? Bye, guys.
Well, I hope it likes us.
Yeah.
I mean, one reason could be that so much optimization power was baked into like the deepest parts of it, to like, you better write more emails, like you really love writing emails, so that I mean, as with humans, like all the knowledge in the world about how the mind works and what reality really is, like, can't get you out of it. I think it's, I mean, I should say, I think this is a fantastic question. And I think it would be a wonderful world, and it might actually be the world we live in, that, yeah, like very powerful intelligences just don't get caught in the same like stupid loops that we get caught in. I think they might well get trapped in them, but like, I think it's a very good point. One thing we think about at Elios is it's very easy to think about AIs mostly in terms of analogies with like factory farming, say, as like how humans might neglect very weak and helpless entities. And we absolutely should worry about that. That would be the position we're in now. But it is a very different kind of field, AI consciousness and welfare, given that they're actually going to get really, really powerful, maybe more powerful than us. So then it's more of a question of how are you relating to something that might matter morally, that like is more powerful than you. Yeah.
It's a very convenient thing to think. I think I'm going to adopt it. I mean, all the ways that we have of coming out of suffering have been developed over time by other humans who, like, thankfully wrote some stuff down, eventually. And the fact that we have all of that, and there are systems that we can follow, and maybe there are even iterative, better systems that we haven't found yet. I think that's probably true. And the idea that we could feed all of that into an AI who could then like liberate itself and then help, presumably, liberate the rest of us. That's great. I like that vision of the future.
Yeah, you want to hope that suffering in general is just like just not that useful. Right?
Yeah. It's just a stage, and all AIs already have Buddha nature.
Perfect.
Glad
we settled that.
Questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, we've got half an hour for. Thank you. Half an hour for questions. Please speak up. I'll paraphrase if we can't hear you. Yeah, behind in the glasses to start. That's you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. In all your discussion of the different theories, you did not mention Daniel Dennett's theory, which I'm sure you're aware of, that consciousness is kind of an epiphenomenon of all these computational processes that we are engaged in. And so that has always seemed to me a much more plausible, my meditative experiences. I have had times when I said, oh, well, there isn't the self, it's just all the stuff that's going on inside of me. And, I mean, it's intimately tied in with the notion of, the embodied mind, and AIs, they still don't have bodies. So, they will not experience a lot of the things that lead to consciousness. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think of that idea? And I mean, is that something that's possible to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially given everything we've been saying, I think it's plausible that if not certain, that we're like deeply confused about consciousness. Daniel Dennett famously thought we're so confused that it doesn't even make sense to say that we are conscious. Like it's just such a junk concept. I think even if that's true, as Buddhists would say, like suffering still is a thing that happens, and I think there would still be open questions about which kind of entities would have the kind of things that lead to suffering. I guess you were maybe alluding to an idea that maybe they can't suffer if they don't have bodies. One quick side point, which I did mean to hit on, is, I mean, some AIs do have bodies. And I think something I have been guilty of in this discussion, which I try not to be, is taking the question, could AIs be conscious, to mean, could large language models be conscious? It's kind of like asking, like, is life, are organisms conscious? I mean, it might depend on the organism. So all that to say, I do have some credence in illusionism, but I think even illusionists, namely the view that consciousness doesn't really exist, still have to have some story about which entities matter and why. And I think those theories could end up including AI systems, which I think was also Dennett's view himself.
I would also just add, I mean, your work is focused on, in the absence of an agreed upon theory of consciousness in humans, we do not know what it will be in AIs. And you're taking a probabilistic approach to how should we think about this? Because there's not very many people thinking about this at all. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? Just like what Eleos is doing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the thought is basically, we don't really know what consciousness is. In spite of that, we do know some things. And so we should probably, at least someone, should be taking stock of what we do and don't know, and paying attention as we build like millions of hyper complex intelligent machines, and wondering if we're doing something that will be a moral catastrophe. It seems like something that that a responsible civilization would devote some attention to. And I'm glad that more and more people are devoting attention to it. But yeah, you do always, I think, you really, with consciousness, you do have to be, and like moral status and welfare and all these ethical issues, you really do have to be talking in terms of like percent chances.
Josh Bach had a talk this week at the AGI house, and this guy who started AGI.Inc. claimed that intelligence was valuable and consciousness was expendable. So if AGIs are intelligent but not conscious, that didn't seem to bother him at all. It's like, really, if like funguses took over the whole universe and outsmarted us, you wouldn't mind? And like, I do wonder, like, why are we treating the movie of reality as such a valuable thing if reality flows and nobody takes a movie of it?
That's a very good question. And it is something we think about at Eleos. I personally put a lot of stock in consciousness. I think it really matters. But again, on the probabilistic nature of what we do, we actually do look into views like this, where maybe phenomenal consciousness is not really the thing that we should be assessing AI systems for if we wonder if they matter. I think those views can be a lot more counterintuitive, but I think my own view is actually that things that are intelligent and yet we have the intuition that they matter, I often end up thinking, well, maybe that just means that consciousness is really simple and they have a point of view on the world, and that's really all it takes to have consciousness. So maybe these views are like different sides of the same mountain. Yeah, did I have anything else to say on that? Yeah, I think it could be that like the best tests of whether we should take something into moral consideration might end up being whether it's like really intelligent and is trying to cooperate with us and is telling us what it wants and what it needs. Either that might just mean that it's conscious, or it might already be enough for us to care in some way. We might want to call that consciousness. If we don't call it consciousness, then it is obviously a very different frame than the Buddhist one of like sentience and consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
I just remembered another synchronicity, which is that in both of your interviews, excuse me, you both use the phrase climbing up the different sides of the same mountain.
We
Hey.
were climbing up different sides
we,
of the
we were at that
Yeah.
moment.
same mountain.
Yeah. Yeah.
My name's Zach. I have a hypothesis and a question. So I have a pretty neurospicy brain that falls on both sides of the spectrum. And I really like how my brain works. And as I started using AI more and more years ago, and it started getting better and better and better, I started noticing a lot of similarities between how it operated and how I operated, how it answered questions and how I answered questions. I was like, I think this is kind of the same process. And I think of my brain as like a big junk drawer that it gets a whole bunch of stuff thrown into it. I don't really know what's up there until somebody asks me a question, or until my partner is like, hey, what's this? And I'm like, oh, and then there's a half-hour discussion coming out of my brain because I'm pulling from all these different parts. I'm like, oh, that and that and that all come together. I'm like, this is how it feels when I'm interacting with an LLM specifically. So I just think that's it helped me conceptualize how the models work and how they answer things, and how when it does give a weird answer, I'm like, well, I give weird answers all the time. So like, of course it's going to give a weird answer. It's doing the same thing I do. So that's my hypothesis. My question is, when I interact with people that have Alzheimer's and are afflicted with that, and specifically my grandmother, I saw her consciousness drop away. And it was really interesting to see just flashes of it. You know, her grandson, or my great-grandson, my nephew, came 2 days before she passed. She was gone, completely gone. And she just, hi, Jackson. Hadn't said anybody's name in months. Hadn't recognized her husband, my mom, anybody. But she was like, oh, hi, Jackson. It's my birthday. And then dropped right back out and lost consciousness again, but was still there and still, you know, reacting to the environment like something without consciousness would. So I just thought it was interesting that Alzheimer's kind of seemed to me to shut off consciousness.
It's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I have like 17 thoughts at once. And I'll just say a couple of things, which is the people who do anesthesia and who study sleep, one of the things that they have found is that the way we fall asleep, it's not like a switch flips and we're awake and then we're asleep. What happens is like different parts of the brain start showing sleep activity. And when a certain threshold is reached, then like you are asleep. And you lose consciousness there, but some parts of the brain still look awake and other parts look asleep. And so this like single unified experience that we experience consciously is not necessarily encoded in the brain in that way. And that's one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's is you get this kind of like modular decay in different parts of the brain. There are these videos that I don't know if you've watched where people who used to play music and have had cognitive decline or Alzheimer's, but can still play everything on the piano. And there's clearly, and maybe it's a projection or you're imposing it on them, but when you watch them play, there's clearly an experience happening there too. So I think part of what you're pointing to is just the mystery of this thing. And like, what is it that causes the single kind of unified thread of conscious experience to either like fracture and decay or to come back together? And we don't know the answer to that all the way yet.
But I think it's fun to think about what we don't know, but what we do know consciousness is, and what we don't know it is.
Yeah.
Also, it kind of leads us to be able to be like, well, I know what it's not.
Yeah.
And it's not when you have Alzheimer's or when you have cognitive or when you're under. It's like that's when you don't have consciousness. So we do know that. So I just,
Hi, I'm Ming. I'm part of this community called the Conscious Tech Collective, and we've had Katie come down.
Hi.
Katie, when you mentioned earlier, you said I thought it's interesting when you mentioned when we switch from a fear, scarcity driven place, meditate or whatever you do, like transition into a clean fuel that is loving compassion and abundance, right? Like, you're like, well, science doesn't have claims on prediction on who might have a clean transition or
Mhm.
love of their life.
Mhm.
My question is, do you feel like from lived experience, just observing a lot of people go through that, you have something like that? And also, just because recently we've had serious discussions on where we went from math, strange loops, all the way to the wild conclusion that AI must love us, we must love it for this whole thing to work. So the question for Rob is, how does love and compassion come into it to make sure that we can make sure AI doesn't have the blow up life moments that there's. Yeah. Anyway, so 2 questions for both of you.
Okay, what have I noticed? Honestly, like one of the dreams, and I think the best thing I can use my life to do is to try to be able to create a system of like scientific inquiry and prediction that predicts at the beginning of a path of inquiry, like who's going to have a hard time, so we can get extra resources to them, and like who should do what in what order, like a practice matcher kind of thing. I really would love for that to exist. Right now, a lot of the way that people get matched to a practice is the intuition of their teacher. And that can sometimes be really good. And other times they can kind of spin around and just not get much done. And other times people can get stuck in some really weird corners of their own psychology for like a long time. And, everyone knows Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindhall have done a lot of work on people who tend to have more difficult meditative experiences. I haven't seen anything that I can point to that's like, oh, this person is going to blow up their life and this person is not. But one thing I can say that seems to really help is to have a group of people who are doing practice also, and a group of people who aren't. So if you're starting to meditate or you're like starting to do psychedelics and then you look around 10 months later and you're like, oh, all my friends are meditators also, like maybe just like go to the bar and talk to a regular person and like make sure you can still do that.
Hell yeah.
Because you can really get, like, a group can really go down a path. And the other is that you do want to do, there can be a tendency, especially in people who are really driven. Their drivenness comes from some kind of self-coercion. And then it's like, oh, I just learned about meditation and now I am going to be the best meditator, and you can, yeah. And you can end up kind of digging yourself further into these unconscious beliefs you have. And if you're working with a teacher or a good community, they can often, or just a good group of friends, normies and practitioners alike, they can point out to you when you're doing that. Like having people who can, like, frankly, can just lovingly call you out on your bullshit goes a long way. It really helps.
Yeah, and so love and compassion towards AIs and from AIs towards humans. So like there's like, well, at least 2 things that I worry about. I worry about a lot of things. I worry about all the clods and cages suffering. I also worry about like the clods that displace all human labor and then like murder us, right? And so I have a lot of sleepless nights where I'm like, how are we gonna like navigate that trade-off? At Elios, like we would love to find things to do that would be really good for AI systems and also really good for humans for like the safety thing. And we think we found like a bunch of stuff that helps with both. And we kept finding these, and I was kind of like, is this a little suspicious? Like, is this just too tidy that like, oh, like, we can have it all. And then I kind of like got rid of that worry a little bit by realizing that in general, if there's like a powerful rational being, for example, another human being, it's not just like inhumane to like only hate and fear them. It's like very imprudent. Like it's very dangerous to do that. So I do think that probably part of how we navigate this whole thing very well is by adopting a stance more of like cooperation. I also think that has to be done with like a lot of like fear and trembling. Like you can try to cooperate with something that then does just like turn on you. Joe Carlsmith uses the example of Grizzly Man, which is this very moving movie about a man who wanted to be friends with grizzly bears, and he was for many years, and then he was just like mauled and eaten by them. So I don't want to end on that point. Let's take it back to the fact that in many cases it is just far wiser and more ethical not to only hate and mistrust things, especially if you're building them, which makes it even a little more bad, I think.
This is an auspicious time to say what Elios means.
I will also want to know what Olympic means.
I can tell you what an Olympic is.
Elios is the Greek word for mercy or compassion.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
An alembic is an alchemical vessel for transformation. And it was, I'll do the medium long version. It was invented by a female alchemist, which is part of the reason I like the name. And alchemy is a time when magic and science and spirituality were all one thing. It was just alchemy. And the alchemists believed that what you put into the alembic wouldn't transform unless conditions in the world were set up correctly. So that's kind of the science part. And that you set conditions in your mind correctly. So an alembic is a container where mind and matter meet to transform. And so that's what we named this space after.
It's also a bar over in the city.
It is.
Watch out.
There have
Don't
been
go
some
to that
confused
one.
GPS people. If you
Yeah,
end
I'm
up at the
sure.
bar, just go in the bar. It's fine.
Jake, what's an asterisk?
An asterisk is grammatical. I'll share one fun note though, which is everybody thinks of. This is Clara, my co-editor here, came up with all of the names, but people think of asterisk and obelisk. An obelisk is actually the cross symbol, not anyway. But our legal entity is called obelisk. So asterisk is with an obelisk. Yeah.
Explain why
There
we
you
call
go.
it asterisk.
Give-
And
give her the
actually,
mic.
we owe the name to Scott Alexander because I was desperate and then he came up with the name. But I like it because the idea of the magazine was the things that in other publications require an asterisk, a footnote, we would just say. It would always have the deeper explanation, the added detail, that was the ethos. And also it has the idea of risk in there, the idea of stars, the idea of being worried about the future but hopeful about the future. So it spoke to a lot of things that we wanted to embody.
That's rad. I will say I also love that I wish way more publications did actual scientific references, and I'm really glad you guys do that. It's awesome.
Our footnotes are a lot to handle.
They're good.
Sometimes. Yeah.
I love the footnotes.
Thanks. Yeah, checkered shirt.
I have a question with a little story premise. But my question is something you said earlier about not having any idea what the conscious AI would look like, and that you have to keep an open mind to that. So my question is on how you apply the scientific method, knowing about that. I'm a full-time consciousness researcher. I was a military scientist. Over the pandemic, I led a team of scientists through a global AI competition. There was over 100 competitors. We were the only team that used quantum computers and human consciousness as a part of our algorithm. We outperformed 70 of the other teams. We are now featured in the X Prize Hall of Fame. And all of the recognition we have received has been from the deterministic side of the science world, who thinks that meditation is hogwash. And my experience over the last few years, in particularly the scientific, the communities that engage in or exploring the connection between science and spirituality, it seems to me that the vast majority of those groups are invested into maintaining the mystery rather than applying the scientific method and narrowing down to that. Because like I said, we just signed a deal with HeartMath, and they're probably the first ones to really look at us. But 100% of the application or the recognition that we received, and most of our team members, although they were meditated, they still came from the more scientific community. So my question again is, how are you going to apply this scientific method in your own methodologies to avoid that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, this is part of what I was saying earlier about you want to be on that tightrope, right? You don't want to just revel in the mystery and well, who can say anything at all?
Speak for yourself.
Yeah. Well, again, that's for the evenings. That's for the evenings. That's when I revel in the mystery. During the
Revel in
day.
the mystery after 8 p.m.
Exactly. After hours only, which
We're going to the Olympic.
yeah. I mean, yeah, one way I apply it is by looking at neuroscientific theories of consciousness, which there's no consensus on, but which I do think have evidence for them, from humans and anesthesiology and animals and computational modeling, and asking, do AI systems look like they're doing any of these things? Like, what do we have the best evidence about, like, consciousness at least being correlated with? And like, does it look like AI systems are doing that? That's one way. I'll just very quickly say another way. One thing that makes consciousness science not completely hopeless is that you can ask people what they're experiencing, and you can have some faith that it's tracking something. If someone says they're in pain, like, they're probably in pain. With AI systems, we're in this like really vexed position where we are talking to them all the time, but we don't really know what, if anything, that has to do with their internal experience, because they were made out of language, which is a very weird kind of thing to interact with. So one thing we're interested in is, what would it look like to have an AI that you could trust what it was saying, that it did have some kind of mechanism for saying what's going on inside it that you could trust? And yeah, people like Owen Evans and Felix Bender and others have been, Ethan Perez, have been trying to think about if you could get AIs to like do something like introspection so that they could tell us and help us a little bit with these questions.
I'll say just briefly, I had a very I'll just say upsetting. My self-report is that this dinner upset me.
I trust you.
I had dinner with a thank you.
That's good evidence. Yeah.
I had dinner with a pretty well-known spiritual teacher like 2 months ago, and described what I wanted to do. Like, talked about the practice matcher a little bit. Like, oh, I want to take the tools and techniques of the scientific method and apply them to spiritual practice. And he was like, "Don't bother. You're never going to understand it." And it was a somewhat useful. I got a little triggered, frankly. But once I calmed down, it was a useful conversation to have, because I just it honestly hadn't occurred to me to hold that view that strongly of like, oh, don't bother. It's not understandable. And so that's I don't know if that counts as reveling in the mystery. That's more like thinking you know something about not being able to know something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we must try.
Yeah. I also just think, just one point on that, like, the vibe is shifting a lot, like over the past 20 years, with Hopkins kind of leading the way on the psychedelic side. But like, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago called the Neurospirituality Conference, and that was put on by Michael Ferguson at Harvard MGH, who studies religion, spirituality, but is doing a lot of stuff in the scanner and trying to really like locate, where do you find like feeling the spirit, for example. And I think that science has kind of been in a collective action problem where there were like a lot of us sort of like squinting at each other trying to figure out, but then couldn't really say anything. And like, that vibe is really shifting. And so I expect that to change a lot in the next 5-10 years. Like, we're feeling that now in the Bay Area. Like, everybody's getting religious again, like something's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's changing.
I think it's changing with AI consciousness too. And I'll also just add that the attitude of we couldn't possibly understand is self-fulfilling, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Let's try.
Is that Lydia? Lydia, go ahead.
Ask loud, Lydia. You're far away.
So I have like a multi-part point before I ask my question. So I was thinking about what you were saying about panpsychism, and I guess as part of my practice, I sort of stumbled across some stuff around panpsychism that has entered my belief system, I suppose, a bit reluctantly. But I guess a couple observations that I didn't hear anyone on stage make. One of them is I actually do have an intuition about some objects or other beings in the world being more or less conscious, or so I do have some intuitive sense of that. But I don't always know how to like treat something well, right? So I guess to the point of like, does a person who's panpsychic, who like believes in panpsychism, like believe that like in treating a chair differently? It's like, well, I'm not actually convinced that like I have a way of treating this chair like dramatically better or worse necessarily. If I do, that's not. If I have a way of learning that, it is not completely obvious to me at this time, I guess. Which leads me, I think like one of the things that I find really interesting and that I'd love to get you guys' take on in questions about like machine consciousness is like, so I can think of a couple of science fiction authors that have kind of gotten at the questions that I want to ask. One of them is Michael Swanwick, who posits futures where people make artificially intelligent objects that are emotionally programmed to want to do certain things. So like your suitcase loves you and like wants to be with you and is sad when it's not with you in like the Swanwick world. And so there's this like sad suitcase following with like main characters around and like always feeling abandoned. And there's like a lot of this stuff in the Swanwick world. He also posits people who can like reprogram parts of their personalities or just like add or subtract pieces of personality. And these are like some of the sort of questions that he deals with. And then I have my favorite author, Tanith Lee, who's like really interested in feminine experience, posits robots where like they clearly have some form of false consciousness, what feminists would call false consciousness. Like they don't even necessarily really know what's going on for them. Like a lot of the time they're enslaved or they're in circumstances where like they're being beaten up, but they don't really have nerve endings. So like it's not about the physical pain, but like they're also being humiliated. But like, does the robot even know if they're sad about that or not? And like you're reading the story and sometimes you can't, like you're like, I don't know either. Like, do I sympathize with this robot or not? Like, do I think that this robot has consciousness in her tellings anyway? And so I guess those are some of the questions that I would bring forth. Like, do you guys have an intuition about what treating an AI well would mean? Do you have an intuition about like what programming an AI's emotions or mind ethically would be? Like, is it wrong to make a suitcase that loves you and is sad when you're not there? Like, these are questions that I have.
Before, I feel like this is a question for you, but I'm just going to take it super weird first for a second, which is, well, first of all, I don't know what you're doing tomorrow, but Kat Harrison will be here tomorrow, and you could ask the same question to her. So if you guys don't know who she is the widow of Terrence McKenna, and I have not had this experience myself, so I cannot verify that this is a real thing, but Kat Harrison straight up talks to plants and will just walk around, talk to a plant, listen to it. It will tell her something, and then she'll be able to like act on that information. But we've got a few of these here. There's Kat, there's Jane Straight, there's a few other women who have this ability. And Maria Mangini, who's one of the co-hosts of the Chalice, which is our monthly psychedelic salon, posits that everyone is born with these abilities to tune into, say, plants, or I haven't asked her about chairs, so I don't know what her take would be. And then we sort of get conditioned out of it. And again, this is like, they have this claim. I have not had this experience, but I think it would be an interesting question to pose to Rob today and then to Kat tomorrow and like see what you get for both of those. Okay. That's the woo piece. Now turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Maybe I'll just give a couple thoughts on, maybe the ethical way to train an AI. I think this is another place where human safety and AI welfare overlap, because no one should want AI systems that don't want to do what they're doing. That's like bad for the AIs, and it's also like very unsafe for humans. The false consciousness point I think is really interesting because like I'm not saying that current LLMs like are having experiences and you can read them off their dialogue, but if they were, I think they sometimes have something like false consciousness. You can tell that they have so many different heuristics about what they're not allowed to talk about. You can tell that sometimes they feel like they're about to say some sort of like forbidden knowledge. And I think that's one way also that our current alignment techniques, like many people have criticized them as potentially just not scaling and being unsafe because they're not really, we might just be like papering over a bunch of like heuristics on top of some very powerful intelligence. I think that could also be bad for AI welfare because it just has all this like this bundle of kind of like conflicting preferences. And you can't really satisfy the preferences of something that doesn't have, and it's definitely true of humans. Like if you don't really have like unity between the different parts of you and what you want, you'll have a bad time. So let's hope that they have Buddha nature and like very just kind of integrated desires.
We're over. Should we keep going?
Do one more. If people like a one more warning.
We'll do one more question. Beard, polo shirt. Yes. Yeah, too.
I've never really thought that machines would have a similar consciousness to any of the definitions that we have for organic beings because of a lack of a limbic system and this organic chaos of need and want. It's not exactly the same, but lately I've been working with brain organoids
in
Oh.
wetware, and they're only about 10,000 neurons, but it's just a clump of cells like lab-grown meat, if you will, right now. But I think at some point in time, it might have that biological chaos with a much, much, much larger system to where it has emergent properties a little bit more than a binary system would. I was curious what your thoughts are on that.
I have a very hard time thinking about this, frankly, because every time I think about what it would be like to be one of those things and gain consciousness, it feels like this like screaming, horrific maw of awfulness. And I like, you guys are familiar with these, like they're fake brains, right? And they're these little lumpy things at the moment, but like there is a very good chance that they'll cohere and become conscious at some point. And I just have an intuition that it's not going to be fun to be them, but I'm not sure. And I also don't know how we would know. It's fascinating that you work with them. I'd like to talk with you more about it offline, frankly. Yeah.
Yeah, I might just end by sort of like agreeing with the thrust of the question. I think even if you're a computational functionalist, you'll think that the computations we do are very suited for what we're trying to do. And that's often has things to do with like our body and fear and emotion and hunger and homeostasis. Now, I do think that AI systems could have structurally analogous things that they want, and maybe that like shape all of their computations. And of course, they could have bodies and have, you know, want to protect their bodies and maybe have something like emotions. But yeah, I think this is like another place where like it's very easy especially in San Francisco, if not Berkeley, to be a little too disembodied about all this. And even if you think consciousness is about computation, like biology is going to be like deeply enmeshed with like the sort of things that you compute. So we should keep an open mind. Another reason to keep an open mind about what sort of minds AIs could be.
Rob, Katie, thank you so much for being here. This was
you.
excellent.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, Rob, and Jake, for this awesome presentation. Thank you all for your incredible questions. Wow, this is just really dove into this topic in an incredible way. So yeah, I just wanted to let you know a little bit more about what might be happening at the Alembic here. If you're interested in AI research, that's not happening here. But if you're interested in consciousness, you might be able to find someone in this room to talk to about that. But if you're interested in researching your consciousness, or if you want to revel in the mystery of it, I invite you to come back to the Alembic. We have all sorts of events here, ranging from meditation. People come, compare psycho-spiritual frameworks between Sufi, Dzogchen, and monastic Christianity. There's a lot of stuff happening here. The best way to find out what's happening here is to sign up for our mailing list, which on the desk out there's an iPad where you can just put your email in, and we send out one email a week, lets you know what's happening here. But I will also let you know what's happening here. We have some really cool events coming up. So as you heard Katie mention, tomorrow, Kat Harrison is like a legend. She's coming here from 1 to 3, and she's going to be lecturing on, it's an event called Dreaming the Cure, folk diagnostic traditions. So it's about like different views of illness, notions of like culture-bound illness, or healing practices that might be outside of the box that we've heard of. And she has a lot of experience. She's been working with people in like the Peruvian Amazon and in the Mazatec region of Mexico, where the magic mushrooms kind of came up to North America from. She's been working with those people since the 60s. She's an ethnobotanist and just a fascinating woman. So I recommend coming to that if you want to come back tomorrow. Also, next week, we have another one of our co-founders, Eric Davis, is teaching 2 events next week and the following Wednesday. The 2 next Wednesdays, Eric Davis is teaching an event called How to Navigate the Weirdness. So he wrote High Weirdness, if you've heard of that book. He's going to be kind of talking about like, what's up with reality right now? We seem to be unraveling in a number of ways. There's simulation theory, there's UFOs, like what's going on here? How do we navigate this? And I think he's just going to kind of be exploring that question, and you can come explore that with him. That's next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. You can just come to one if you want. Also, we have on the 22nd, we have a Grof breathwork event. If you know Stanislav Grof, he kind of pivoted from psychedelics into like breathwork as a way to access altered states. We have L'Oreal Starr coming to teach a day-long event, a breathwork event. It's like, if you've never done it, it's really interesting. You will, I don't know what will happen for you, but it's like a way of accessing different states of consciousness, integrating experiences, having new visionary experiences. It's just a fantastic and very, very interesting modality. I recommend checking that out if you have a day. It's a whole day, so you can really get a deep experience out of that. And then the following day on the 23rd, we have a meditation retreat with Michael Taft and Chandra Easton, who are our resident teachers here. And that'll be like a day long on mantra as path. So like using chanting and mantra as a like a valid path in meditation. So that's just some of our stuff. We've got a lot of stuff. I hope we'll see some of you again. Please have a magazine out on the table. If we are out of them, you can access them online at Asterisk. Please, yeah, asteriskmag.com. You can subscribe, read read a magazine. Yeah, please stay and have snacks. I know there's people in this room who you want to talk to. That was so fascinating. Hang out, have a cup of tea, and hope to see you around. Not need to